evening, good morning, and good night, friends who follow the program Straight Talk. We are happy to be able to bring you these programs on a weekly basis because we are convinced that the message that it takes to viewers has been most welcome, not only by our viewers, but by many who have been making inquiries about the topics and even making suggestions about the topics we should be focusing on Straight Talk. Today, or this week, we will be dealing with an interesting topic which, to my mind, is of great interest not only to people in Guyana, but people outside of Guyana. I want to talk this week about blacks in the People's Progressive Party, or as some would say, African Guyanese in the People's Progressive Party. I chose this topic primarily because only recently, in fact, on the 10th of October, one of our stalwarts passed away. I refer to Comrade Cyril Belgrave, a staunch and foremost fighter in the People's Progressive Party, who passed away recently in the city of New York in the United States of America. This program, therefore, will be dedicated to Comrade Belgrave, as we call him, and all that he stood for while he served the People's Progressive Party and the people of Guyana. Comrade Cyril exemplified all that the PPP stood for: peace, progress, and prosperity. He fought for peace at a time when our country was in economic, political, and social turmoil. I refer to the period of the 60s. That is to say, the 1957 to 1964 PPP government, led by the Premier of the country at the time, Dr. Chedi Jagan. Those of you who may have read The Western Trial, the famous book written by Dr. Jagan, would recall in that book the efforts that were made by the CIA and others to remove his government from office. It was during that period that we had race riots, burnings and lootings of many businesses in the city of Georgetown, and the beating of persons known to be supportive of the PPP. It was during that period that we had the Wisma massacre, when thousands of Indo-Guyanese had to flee the Linden, Mackenzie, or Wisma area to come to Georgetown or the coastland in order to settle and begin a new life. It was during that period that Cyril Belgrave and many of the Afro-Guyanese stalwarts stood firmly in favor of peace and democracy in Guyana. I want to say also that it was during this period that in the fight for social progress, Comrade Belgrave was an active participant. It was during that period of the 57 to 64 government of the PPP that Comrade Cyril witnessed many of the economic and social transformations, programs, and projects started by the PPP government. But I must mention that Comrade Cyril was first and foremost a waterfront worker, what we would call in those days a stevedore, men who worked on the waterfront to unload and load cargo onto ships, bringing produce and taking produce from our country, imports and exports. During that period, there was an 80-day strike. Comrade Belgrave, along with his colleagues on the waterfront, refused to go on strike against the government they were supporting. And they stood firmly against any effort to break and to destroy and remove the government from office. It was that kind of exemplary behavior that brought Comrade Belgrave and many of the Afro-Guyanese members of the PPP to the forefront. In other words, he was an example of the progressive African tradition, not of the reactionary traditions that the People's National Congress established in this country. I want to say that it appears as though there are some in our country who believe that they have the monopoly on Afro-Guyanese, or as they call them, African Guyanese. This is not so. And I will elucidate on this as we go along. It is these individuals who believe that they have a sacred right to determine the future of African Guyanese in our country. But I'd like to make it very clear that contrary to their exhortations and their expectations, the reality of Guyanese politics show something different. When the split in the PPP took place in 1955, the split did not take racial lines. In other words, the split was not along racial lines. A large majority of the people who supported Dr. Jagan were Afro-Guyanese, and they stayed with the PPP. The split was along class lines, because if you examine the persons who stayed with Mr. Burnham, they were of the middle and the upper classes of our country. Majority of poor farmers, workers of Indo and Afro-Guyanese stayed with Dr. Jagan because they were convinced that his policies, his programs, and his ideology was in their interest. What this situation showed is that politicians like myself should never overestimate or underestimate the intelligence of ordinary people. They are quite capable of, as we would say, sussing out or interpreting political developments and political ambitions of politicians. And so it was not difficult for them to spot the opportunistic tendencies that had appeared in the PPP and was exemplified in the splitting activities of Mr. Burnham. So it is important for us to recall that the split that took place in the PPP in 1955, which led to the creation of the PNC and the PPP remaining as it is, did not take those kind of approaches that many people felt was that had occurred when the split took place. It took class lines. By class lines we mean that people of a particular economic standing, the property, people who own properties, people who had lots of money, people who belong to a particular profession, these are the people that went with Mr. Burnham. The poor people, the poor farmers, some intellectuals stayed with Dr. Jagan across racial lines, both Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese. So when we come to discuss the question of race and class, it is important that we use as a yardstick for measuring this phenomena examples like Comrade Cyril Belgrave. Comrade Cyril Belgrave never fell victim to racial politics. He never fell victim to ethnocentrism, and that one group of people ought to dominate over another group of people. He never fell victim also to class politics. And if there was any class politics that he supported, that was the politics of the working class. This primarily occurred because Comrade Belgrave was first and foremost a trade unionist. As I mentioned earlier, he was a waterfront worker. He joined the Guyana Labor Union, the union of Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow. He became an active member in the union and was elected to the executive branch of the waterfront workers of the Guyana Labor Union Waterfront Workers Branch. Later on, he was elected to the National Executive Council of the Guyana Labor Union. And he used those fora, he used every opportunity while occupying positions in those bodies to advance the interests of the working people and the poorer class of people in our country. He was very articulate in speaking about labor-related issues. Anything or any issue that affected the working people, and particularly the working class, Comrade Belgrave was in the forefront representing those interests. As a result of his activism in the trade union movement, he was eventually selected by the PBP to serve in the city council. He served in the Georgetown City Council for a number of years, and I have been able to witness how Comrade Belgrave was effective as a city councillor, representing all classes and strata in our country, in whichever part of the city they live. And he was not only a seat warmer. He did not only go to meetings of the city council. He walked the streets. He visited almost every ward, every nook and cranny, to establish what were the local problems that people or residents in each ward, in each area of Guyana were facing. And with the facts at his disposal, with facts in his hands, he took that to the city council to represent the residents of the city of Georgetown. And that in itself made him a very effective councillor in the city council of Georgetown. As a result of his effectiveness and the activism that he pursued as a councillor in Georgetown, he was eventually selected to be a member of parliament. He was elected to be a member of parliament by the leadership of the People's Progressive Party precisely because he understood quite well the problems of workers in Guyana, and obviously by extension because the People's Progressive Party is a working class party and represents the working class and the entire working people of our country. While a member of parliament, Comrade Belgrave spoke on almost every issue pertaining to labor and the welfare of workers in our country. He was an ardent fighter, a staunch supporter, and very articulate member of parliament or parliamentarian when it came to workers' rights and labor issues. He drew the respect and admiration of many because of his erudite contributions in the National Assembly. Again, I wish to point out that all of these attributes of Comrade Belgrave was represented in or reflected in the positions, views of many of the Afro-Guyanese who supported the People's Progressive Party. And there were many. I should also point out in this program that many of you may recall in 1992, when the first free and fair election was held in a post-independent Guyana, and when it became clear that the PPP had won the majority of votes, the former president, or the then president, Mr. Hoyt, made a public statement saying that there was no way that the PPP could have won all those votes. Because when they looked at the kind of support and the kind of voters that the PPP would attract votes, they could not attract the majority of votes they claimed that they attracted. That was Mr. Hoyt's position. In other words, Mr. Hoyt was saying that with so many East Indians on the list, the PPP could not win the elections. He was looking at the voters list from a racial point of view. But there was some coincidence between what he said and what Dr. Jagan said later on. Dr. Jagan made the point that even if all the East Indians in Guyana voted for the PPP, still the PPP would not be able to win by itself. That is precisely why in the run-up to the elections in 1992, the party, together with others, formed the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, along with other political parties, to fight for free and fair elections. It was later revealed that apart from the support which the PPP won during the elections or in the voting for a new government, the PPP had attracted a large majority of Afro-Guyanese as well as Amerindians. And it was that what we describe as the crossover vote that brought the PPP the majority of votes to win the 1992 elections. This is what Mr. Hoyt and the PNC could not understand. They could not understand, and they did not accept there had been a significant number of crossover votes to the People's Progressive Party, adding to the traditional support that the party enjoyed, resulting in the PPP winning the elections in 1992. And it was because the PPP maintained this support across the racial and political lines of this country that it was able to remain in office, winning elections after elections up to 2011, when events began to take a different turn for the worse. My friends, our friend and comrade Mr. Cyril Belgrave was part and parcel of all those struggles. He, along with thousands of Afro-Guyanese supporting our party, leading our party on the local front and on the ground, contributed enormously to the PPP being what it is today, a national party. Some people argue that the PPP is an Indian party. This is far from the truth. They are, in the PPP, the majority of supporters and members being Indo-Guyanese. But this does not necessarily mean that the party is an Indian party. The PPP represents all classes and social strata in our country. The workers, the farmers, the intellectuals, the business class, the professional class, the youth, the students. And by the way, this support comes from every region in the country. And this is manifested in the fact In the last two local government elections, the PPP won the majority of local authorities or regional councils and NDCs in the 10 administrative regions of Guyana. This is an excellent example to show the national nature of the PPP and the support it enjoys across racial, across class, across regional lines in our country. And that is why we continue to insist that the People's Progressive Party, with men and women like Cyril Belgrave, are the ones who made this contribution to the PPP to make it the party that it is today. The PPP continues to be a party representing our class and social strata in our country. When we look at what are the programs and policies of the coalition, we find something completely different. As soon as they got into office, they increased the salaries of their ministers of government. This is a class issue. Why increase the salaries of the ministers of the government and take away monies that were given to single parents to assist with their children? Why take away money that were given to the police, the soldiers and other members of the disciplined services and take only for themselves? This, of course, is a good example to show what kind of government we have at this present point in time in our country. Now there's a big debate on this question of cash transfers as a result of the petroleum industry or revenues that will flow from the petroleum industries in our country. This debate is an interesting debate because it is taking on different colors and it's taking on different directions. But the fundamental point in the question of cash transfers is the opposition to the suggestion that every single Guyanese family, based on a targeted approach, should benefit from these cash transfers. And with this in mind, most of the people are of the view that those who could afford should not benefit from cash transfers. It is those who cannot afford that should benefit from these cash transfers. Of course, those who could afford and those who will not afford or cannot afford will have to be studied very carefully in order to ensure that there is no discrimination in the allocation of cash transfers to the citizens of our country. Because after all, we are all Guyanese. This is all our national patrimony, and therefore we as Guyanese look forward to benefiting from the revenues that will flow from our new petroleum industry. My friends, racial and working class unity is something that, or an objective that Comrade Belgrave and many others of his like fought for in our country. Unfortunately, we have not been able to accomplish racial and working class unity. But it is an objective that we have to strive to achieve. There is not a single Guyanese, to my mind, who would say that they're opposed to racial and working class unity in our country. Most Guyanese are convinced that this is the direction our country must go. The opposite of racial and working class unity is racial division and disunity. Which Guyanese, in and out of Guyana, would want that? We are one people with one nation, or in one nation with one destiny. To make this a reality, It means that we have to work assiduously and work as hard as we can to bring about racial and working class unity. This is one of the foundations in order to realize our national objectives. Comrade Belgrave, my friends, stands tall before all of us who knew him. And it's important for us who knew him to talk about him, to blow our trumpets about him, and to glorify him, to let people know, especially the younger generation, what Comrade Belgrave stood for. He, like many other Afro-Guyanese in our country, have fought a long, hard, and bitter struggle. His journey finally came to an end recently. But we believe that the best commitment, the best homage we can pay to Comrade Cyril Belgrave is to follow his example, to commit ourselves to continue with what he stood for, to commit ourselves to fight for racial and working class unity in our country, and to make sure that every Guyanese, man, woman, and child, benefit from all that we can give and all that we can take from our country in order to make it a peaceful, prosperous, and progressive land. Thank you once again, my friends. I look forward to being with you on our next program, Straight Talk. This program being dedicated to Comrade Cyril Belgrave, a former Member of Parliament, a former City Councillor, a waterfront worker and trade unionist, who was eventually awarded the CCH in honor of the work and the contribution he made to our nation. Long live the memory of Comrade Cyril Belgrave. We pay homage and we respect the memories and the contributions that he made while he was alive, not only to the PVP, but to our country as well. Thank you and goodbye.